Chapter 8. So Bitches Can Hate. One hobby I did not pick up was crocheting, an obsession among prisoners throughout the system. Some of the handiwork was impressive. The inmate who ran the laundry was a surly rural white woman named Nancy, whose dislike for anyone but Northerners was hardly a secret. Her personality left a lot to be desired, but she was a remarkable crochet artist. One day in C-Dorm, I happened upon Nancy standing with my neighbor Allie B. and Mopey Sally, all howling with laughter. "What?" I asked innocently. "Show her, Nancy," giggled Allie. Nancy opened her hand. Perched there in her palm was an astonishingly lifelike crochet penis. Average in size, it was erect, fashioned of pink cotton yarn, with balls and a smattering of brown cotton pubic hair and a squirt of white yarn ejaculate at the tip. "More sentimental than functional, I guess," was all I could manage. Allie B. lived several cubes down in B-Dorm and was a tall, skinny woman with broad shoulders and a strong jaw, who teetered between odd-looking and good-looking. She loved candy bars and reminded me of Wimpy from Popeye. "I will gladly pay you Tuesday for a Snickers bar today." A daffy horn dog and an unrepentant junkie, she was counting the days out loud until she could go home, get laid, and score some junk, in that order. She was straightforward and unapologetic about her love of narcotics. Heroin was her drug of choice, but she was willing to get high on anything, and often threatened to sniff the solvents at her job in the construction shop. I didn't think there was anything there worth huffing. Allie's sidekick was a young woman from western Pennsylvania who proudly called herself a redneck. I called her Pennsatucky. One day, Pennsatucky and I were standing at my cube in B-Dorm when my next-door neighbor Colleen and her pal Carlotta Alvarado walked by. Colleen had a big shit-eating grin on her face as she asked Carlotta, "So, what'd you think about that little toy I gave you last week? Pretty sweet, huh?" Carlotta laughed a rich, satisfied laugh, and they kept walking. I cocked an eye at Pennsatucky. "Dildos," she drawled in her backwoods twang. I must have looked intrigued because she hastened to explain. "Colleen probably carved something nutty out of a carrot or something. Different than the usual." "Which is?" "Pencil with an ace bandage wrapped around it, with one of them finger condoms from the infirmary over the whole deal. Doesn't that sound enjoyable?" "Huh. When I was locked up in county, they used to make dildos out of a spork, a maxi pad, and a finger from a rubber glove." Another use for maxi pads revealed. The industrious hobbyists of the penal system would work with whatever materials they had. Desperate times, desperate measures, huh, Pennsatucky? Whatever that means. Just as we had sent 8 prisoners down the hill to the drug program, the FCI returned the favor in kind, with a fresh batch of hard-timers graduating up the hill. Sometimes these women were very close to release, and sometimes they still had a stretch of time to do. Regardless, they usually hung together for a time, quietly watching the situation, unless, of course, they had friends in the camp, either from the street or from the inside. One of the new arrivals from the FCI was Morena, a Spanish woman who looked like a deranged Mayan princess. Deranged not because she was unkempt or wild in her overall appearance. She had the clear air of someone who knows how to do time and was immaculately groomed with good unis, pressed and sharp, and she was generally very composed. But Morena had unsettling eyes. She would stare at you. Those crazy brown eyes were powerfully expressive, and you couldn't tell what the hell it was they were telegraphing. Whatever was going on in her head, it was taking a lot of effort for her to restrain it, and her eyes were giving her away. It wasn't just me who noticed her spooky eyes. "That one's not right," said Pop, tapping her temple. "Watch it." Imagine my surprise when Morena asked if she could walk with me in the morning to work. She had been assigned to the safety shop in CMS. I always chose to walk the half-mile to work alone, a little freedom that I treasured. I had no idea what to talk to her about. I thought she was about my age, wasn't sure where she was from. Her English was heavily accented and good, and I sure as hell wasn't going to start asking personal questions. How do you like safety? Was pretty neutral. Crazy Eyes couldn't take offense at that. It's fine, she snorted. I know the boss from the FCI. It's no problem. Where are you from, chica? I gave her the standard bare minimum information. New York City, 15 months. You have children? No children. Did she? Morena laughed, a throaty, crazy laugh that said, "Oh, you naive and innocent straight girl, you can't even tell that I'm a bulldagger on the outs, not just up in this joint where one cannot get any dick, and how I will relish turning you out." No, baby, I got no children. Over the next week or two, Morena was my companion on the walk to work, like it or not. I got an earful about her low opinion of the women in the camp. They are like little girls. They think this shit is a game, she opined, curling her lip. I was scrupulously polite and non-committal, because Crazy Eyes made me nervous. In addition to many halting conversations on the way to work, her interactions with me in the camp sharply increased. Morena would materialize at the entry of my cube and coo at me in a bizarre way. "Hello, baby." I had decided when I moved into B-dorm that I did not want anyone visiting me in my cube. The space was tiny and shared with Natalie, and was as close to privacy as I was going to get. I went out to socialize. If I was in my cube, I was either reading or writing letters or sleeping. Other women, especially the young ones, love to have people pile into their cubes, sit on their beds and footstools, and stand around and jaw. This was not for me. "Looks like you have a new friend, Bunky," Natalie observed dryly. One day, while we were walking to work, Crazy Eyes cut to the chase. She was once again ranting about the immaturity and silliness of the women in the camp. "They act like they are on vacation here or something, running around and acting silly. They need to act like women." I said rather mildly that most of the women were really bored, and perhaps not so well educated, and that they did indeed divert themselves with foolish things. This observation prompted a sudden and passionate declaration from Crazy Eyes. "Piper, they are like children, and I am looking for a real woman. I cannot be bothered with this bullshit, with these silly girls. On the street I am a big-time drug dealer. I do serious business, big business. My life is serious. Even in here I cannot waste my time with these silly bitches. I need a real woman." I opened my mouth and then closed it. I felt like I had been dropped into a telenovela. Morena's bosom was practically heaving under her prison khakis. Hey, I could understand what she was saying. Her life was indeed serious. Her desires were serious. And I could understand why she didn't want to mess around with some trifling bimbo who was experimenting with lesbianism just to entertain herself in prison. But hell no, not me. I tried to choose my words with delicacy. Well, Morena, I'm certain that you'll find the right woman for you. It just might take a while for her to show up, right?" She looked at me with those unreadable, crazy eyes. Was she pissed? Hurt? Vindictive? I couldn't tell. I was vastly relieved when we got to work. The 10-minute walk never seemed so long. I kept the conversation to myself. Morena made a few more attempts to express her need for a real woman, perhaps thinking that I was too dense to get her meaning. But my response remained the same. I was sure that the right woman was out there somewhere in the correctional system, and that Providence would deliver her to Danbury with all haste. It wouldn't be fast enough for me. Once it was clear that I was not her future boo, Crazy Eyes quickly lost interest in me. The companionable walks stopped, and the cubicle drop-bys ceased. She still greeted me, but in a disinterested way. I felt that I had navigated the situation with as much grace as I had available, and no hideous repercussions to my tacit rejection seemed forthcoming. I breathed a little easier, hoping Crazy Eyes would spread the word to the other committed lesbians that I was not like that, even though in some other lifetime I had been. For the first time in many years, I was living a completely chemical-free existence, right down to going off birth control pills. My body was returning to its actual organic state, and after almost 3 months of enforced celibacy, I was feeling very warm under the collar. If you had spit on me, I might have sizzled. Larry was clearly feeling the pressure of our separation, too. His hello kisses in the visiting room grew more ardent, and he wanted to play footsie under the card tables. My own yearnings for footsie were severely tempered by my fear of the guards. I understood on a visceral level, as he did not, that they really could end a visit and take all my visiting privileges away. This point was demonstrated to Larry one day when gay porn star, also known as Officer Rotmanson, materialized during visiting hours. Gay porn star was a strutting sadist with a flat-top hairdo, close-set eyes, and a bristling mustache who resembled nothing so much as a Village People tribute band reject. He had come into the visiting room to see his little buddy, Officer Jesus is my homeboy, who was filling in for the regular visitation CO and boring 2 prisoners who were helpers in the visiting area with predictions about the rapture. As I entered the visiting room, I kissed Larry hello, and then he stole another kiss as we sat down at our assigned table. Seeing this, gay porn star bellowed across the room, pointing, "Hey! One more time, and you're out of here!" Every head turned to stare silently. Larry was rattled. What the hell is wrong with that guy? He tried to grab my knee under the table. "That's just what they're like, darling. Don't touch me. He's not fucking around." It killed me to snap at him like that, when all I wanted was for him to touch me. But Larry didn't understand that pushing boundaries in prison can have dire consequences. These men had the power not only to end our visits, but to lock me up in solitary on a whim. My word against theirs would count for little. Afterward, still traumatized, I asked Elena, one of the prisoners who worked in the visiting room, what the hell had happened. "Oh, the little guy was watching you, and he was turning red," she said. "So Rotmanson got pissed off when he saw that his buddy was embarrassed seeing you kiss." The next week, the regular CO was back on duty. "I heard you were out of line last week," she said, patting me down before allowing me in to see Larry. "I'll be watching you." In such a harsh, corrupt, and contradictory environment, one walks a delicate balance between the prison's demands and your own softness and sense of your own humanity. Sometimes at a visit with Larry, I would be overwhelmed, suddenly overcome with sadness about my life at that moment. Could our relationship weather this insanity? Larry had been steadfast for all those years waiting for me to go to prison. Now that I was here, could we make it through the real test? Our minutes in the visiting room were so precious. We could never bear to discuss anything difficult or negative. We wanted every second in that room to be sweet and perfect. Different women had different ways of dealing with prison's impact on their relationships. On a sleepy weekend afternoon, I stood by the microwave with my friend Rose Marie. She was in the midst of an elaborate cooking project, making gooey cheese and chicken enchiladas, and I was helping, although I could be counted on to chop an onion, tricky with a butter knife. Mainly my help took the form of indulging her passion for talking about our future weddings. Rose Marie was engaged to a sweet, quiet guy who visited her faithfully every week, and she was obsessed with wedding planning. She had subscriptions to all the bridal rags, which piled up in her cubicle, and she loved to dream and scheme about her big day. She also wanted to plan for my big day. Larry and I had been engaged for almost 2 years. But I was hardly interested in a traditional ceremony, plus I knew we weren't getting married any time soon, and this colored my willingness to take wedding planning very seriously, which drove Rose Marie nuts. When I told her I would wear a red bridal dress, She squealed with outrage. On this particular day, Rose-Marie was preoccupied with my headgear. If I was not going to wear a veil, a shame, she thought, then a tiara was most advisable. I snorted. "Rose-Marie, do you really think I am putting a crown on my head to walk down the aisle?" In the heart of a budding wedding planner, anything is possible. As Rose-Marie filled tortillas and argued passionately in favor of seed pearls, Carlotta Alvarado approached. She wanted to know who was in line for the microwave. This was a strategic question. Carlotta, a committed system gamer, was assessing who would let her cut the line, and Rose-Marie was a definite possibility. The two of them worked together training seeing eye dogs, and while Carlotta, an around-the-way girl from the Bronx, and Rose-Marie, a preppy geek from New England, didn't seem to have a lot in common, they got along very well. Rose-Marie agreed to put the enchiladas on pause so Carlotta could fry some onions with Sazón, the Latin seasoning that makes everything orange, salty, and spicy. "Carlotta's engaged, too," said Rose-Marie as the onions sizzled. Engagements were rare around the camp. "That's great, Carlotta. What's your man's name?" Carlotta beamed. "Rick. He's my sweetie. He comes to visit me all the time. Yeah, I'm getting married. I can hardly wait." "It's so exciting," sang Rose-Marie. Then she grinned. "Tell her what you told me, Carlotta." Carlotta smiled triumphantly. "Yeah, I can't wait to get married. You know why?" I didn't. Carlotta stepped back to better deliver the truth that when she contemplated holy matrimony made her heart beat faster. She pushed her palm toward me, index finger pointing skyward for emphasis. "So bitches can hate." Bitches? "That's right. I'm going back to my neighborhood, and I'm going to get married, and that will show all those bitches who talk shit about me. I'll be married with my man, and you know what they'll have? No man. A bunch of babies by a bunch of guys. I cannot wait to get married so those bitches can just hate on me." I studied Carlotta, her pretty face bright and animated as she envisioned her future, one that included her man, some bitches, and a ring around her finger. I was fairly certain that she would get what she wanted. Among all the women at the camp, she was the one who could always figure out an angle. She had a primo prison job training the service dogs. She had all the contraband onions she needed. She ran a side business doing pedicures, and rumor was that she even had a cell phone secreted somewhere in the prison, so she could call her man on the outside without waiting in line and paying the prison's sky-high rates. She was a smart cookie, with an unsentimental eye on the world. Rick, I concluded, was a lucky guy. As for me, I felt caught between the world I lived in now and the world to which I longed to return. I saw that those who couldn't come to terms with their imprisonment had a very difficult time with staff and with other prisoners. They were in constant conflict because they couldn't reconcile themselves with their fellow prisoners. I saw young women who had been running wild in poverty most of their lives rail against authority, and middle-aged, middle-class women who were aghast to find themselves living among people they thought were beneath them. I thought they were all unnecessarily unhappy. I hated the control the prison exercised over my life, but the only way to fight it was in my own head. And I knew I wasn't better than other women locked up in there, even the ones I didn't like. On the other hand, some people were way too comfortable in prison. They seem to have forgotten the world that exists on the outside. You try to adjust and acclimate, yet remain ready to go home every single day. It's not easy to do. The truth is, the prison and its residents fill your thoughts, and it's hard to remember what it's like to be free, even after a few short months. You spend a lot of time thinking about how awful prison is, rather than envisioning your future. Nothing about the daily workings of the prison system focuses its inhabitants' attention on what life back on the outside as a free citizen will be like. The life of the institution dominates everything. This is one of the awful truths of incarceration. The fact that the horror and the struggle and the interest of your immediate life behind prison walls drives the real world out of your head. That makes returning to the outside difficult for many prisoners. So I became obsessed with the almost daily departures and found myself asking, who's going home this week? I kept a running tally in my mind, and if I liked the person, I would head up to the front door of the visiting room after breakfast to wave them off, a ritual observed by a gaggle of prisoners for every departure. It was bittersweet to watch them leave, because I would have given anything to be going with them. People planned their going-home outfit, which someone from the outside would ship to receiving and discharge, R&D, for them. Their friends would prepare a special meal, and they would start to give away all their stuff, commissary clothing and good uniforms and blankets and other things of value that they had accumulated while doing their time. I fantasized about giving all my stuff away. Watching people arrive was less pleasant but also interesting. I certainly felt bad for them, but my regard was tinged with a funny little sense of superiority, because at least I knew more about the workings of the camp than they did and thus had a leg up. This impulse was often proved wrong when someone turned out to be returning to Danbury after violating the terms of their probation. They would often march right into the counselor's office and ask for their old bunkie and job assignment back. I knew that as many as 2/3 of all released prisoners are locked up again, a fact that mystified me at first. There was no way they would get me back in prison. Ever. And yet, no one ever seems surprised to see a familiar face return to Danbury. Self-surrenders who came to the camp were easy to spot. They were usually white and middle class, and looked totally overwhelmed and scared to death. I would ask myself, did I look that wigged out? And then I'd go get them some of the extra shower shoes and toothpaste I now kept stashed in my locker for such occasions. But most new arrivals had been in custody for a while, sometimes since their initial arrest, if they had not been granted bail or couldn't make the bail payment. And they were coming from county jails or from federal jails, called MCCs or MDCs, Metropolitan Correctional Centers, or Metropolitan Detention Centers. The county jails were described to me as universally nasty, full of drunks, prostitutes, and junkies, not up to the standards of us federales. No shock, then, that the women arriving at Danbury from county usually looked fried. They seemed happy to get to Danbury because the conditions were better. That depressed me. Also intriguing were the women like Morena, who had earned their way up the hill from the high-security FCI to the minimum-security camp. In theory, the really hardened and potentially dangerous criminals. They were always very composed in terms of physical appearance, hair done and uniforms just so, with their own name and reg number embossed on the shirt pocket. Campers didn't get that. They never looked scared, but they were often freaked out because they were unaccustomed to as much freedom as we were afforded, and they reported that there was far less to do in the camp in the way of programs and recreation. In fact, many of them were miserable in the camp and wanted to go back to max lockup. One woman, Coco, marched right into the counselor's office and explained that she couldn't handle the freedom, and would they please send her back down the hill, because she didn't want to lose her good time due to an escape attempt. I heard that the truth was she couldn't stand to be apart from her girlfriend, who was still down in the FCI. Coco was sent back the next day. Spring was coming slowly to the Connecticut hills, and we were starting to shake off the cold. Being cooped up with so many wackos was affecting my world view, and I feared that I would return to the outside world a bit cracked too. But I was learning something every day, resolving some new subtlety or mystery through observation or instruction. The track by the Fieldhouse gym was now mush, but I slogged determinedly around it, encouraged by the fact that I kept getting thinner and thinner, and every visitor who came to see me said with astonishment, "You look fantastic." I was making those mucky circles in silence, because the commissary was still out of the damn crappy headset radios that cost $42. Every week I put the radio on my shopping list before I turned it in, and every week, no radio. The commissary CO, who was a real prick in public and friendly in private, just barked, "No radios," when I asked when they would get some. All the other new arrivals were in the same boat, and we commiserated bitterly. Movie night was all about reading lips for me, and my time on the track or in the gym left me with my thoughts echoing noisily in my skull. I had to have that radio. Lionel, the inmate consigliere of the warehouse, was one of my closest neighbors in our cramped quarters. Her bunkie had been the target of Lily Cabrales's protest pee on my first morning in B dorm, and it was she who had sopped up the puddle. Lionel had a black name plaque like Natalie's, indicating that she had been down the hill in the FCI and probably had a long sentence. She was formidable, but still friendly, a no-nonsense player when it came to doing time, and a cheerful Christian who was quick with a wry observation. Lionel was vocal about what you might call community issues, not stealing, acting right during count, treating other prisoners with respect. She wasn't about to go out of her way to befriend a random white girl like me, but she would still say good morning and occasionally smile at my attempts at humor when we found ourselves side by side at the bathroom sinks. One quiet afternoon, as I was fixing lights in B dorm, Lionel materialized outside her cube. This was unusual, as she would normally be at work in the warehouse. I seized the opportunity to find out more about the mysterious radios. "Lionel, I hate to bother you, but I've got a question." I quickly explained my radio problem. "I'm going crazy with no music. I just can't get the CO to tell me when they're coming in. What do you think?" Lionel gave me a skeptical, sidelong look. "You know you're not supposed to ask warehouse folks about that. We're not allowed to talk about any goods in the warehouse." I was taken aback. "No, Lionel, I didn't know that. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I'm sorry." "No problem." May was a week away. The sun was starting to make itself known now, drying up the mud. There were leaves on the trees, migratory birds, and tons of baby bunnies all over the track. I realized that it wasn't so bad to be listening to my own thoughts when there was so much to look at. I had made it 3 months, almost a quarter of my sentence. If I had to watch silent movies for the next 10, so be it. I almost didn't bother putting the radio on my commissary list that week. Someone who had already shopped was complaining that they were still out. So when a new radio headset came flying past the register to land in my grocery pile, I just stared at it. "Is there something wrong with you, Kerman?" shouted the CO. "It's true what they say about blondes, huh?" I looked past him, into the glassed-in commissary, and spotted Lionel. She didn't meet my eye. I just smiled to myself as I signed my receipt and handed it back to him. It was funny how things worked around here, how other prisoners could make things happen. I wasn't really sure what I had done right, but did it matter? That week, the entire population of the camp was summoned into the main hallway for an impromptu meeting with the staff, a bunch of white men looking too bored to smirk. We were told, 1. Your sanitation is wanting. We will hold more inspections. 2. No smoking under the unit manager's window. You have been warned. 3. No sex in the camp. No exceptions. 0 tolerance. This means you. We were collectively unimpressed. All of us prisoners knew that Finn, the senior counselor, was way too lazy to bother inspecting the dorms beyond the bare minimum and didn't care enough to enforce most rules. The only thing Finn did appear to care about was hierarchy, as demonstrated to us by the nameplate fiasco. And the administrative unit manager didn't give a rat's ass about anything having to do with the camp. True to the staff's charges against us, though, there had been quite an uptick in sex-in among the ladies since Butorsky's departure, which led to some comical matchups. Big Mama was a cheerful leviathan who lived in A dorm, quick with a play on words, generally benevolent, and prodigious in girth. She was slim on modesty, however, as was proven by her shameless sex-in with a series of much younger, much skinnier girls in her open cubicle. I liked Big Mama and was fascinated by her romantic success. How did she do it? What were her tricks? Were they the same as those employed by fat middle-aged men to get young nubile girls to sleep with them? The girls didn't then turn around and disrespect her, so was it curiosity on their part? I was curious, but I wasn't quite brave enough to ask. There was a constant dance between the prisoners and the staff around the rules. With a new rotation of officers on detail in the camp, the dance would start anew. I was washed in relief to be rid of gay porn star. It was amazing how much more bearable it was around the camp with him gone. In porn star's place, we now had Mr. Maple, who seemed to be his predecessor's exact opposite. Mr. Maple was young, recently out of the military after service in Afghanistan, and exaggeratedly courteous and friendly. He was instantly popular with the women of the camp. I still considered all COs the enemy on principle, but I was beginning to understand a bit better why a prisoner might look at them with anything other than a baleful eye. Regardless of gay for the stay, the vast majority of female prisoners are heterosexual, and they miss male companionship, male perspective, and male attention. A fortunate minority have a husband or a boyfriend who visits regularly, but most are not so lucky. The only men they come in contact with are prison guards, and if the CO is a half-decent human being, he will find himself the object of crushes. If he is a cocky bastard, even more so. It is hard to conceive of any relationship between two adults in America being less equal than that of prisoner and prison guard. The formal relationship, enforced by the institution, is that one person's word means everything, and the other's means almost nothing. One person can command the other to do just about anything, and refusal can result in total physical restraint. That fact is like a slap in the face. Even in relation to the people who are anointed with power in the outside world, cops, elected officials, soldiers, we have rights within our interactions. We have a right to speak to power, though we may not exercise it. But when you step behind the walls of a prison as an inmate, you lose that right. It evaporates, and it's terrifying. And pretty unsurprising when the extreme inequality of the daily relationship between prisoners and their jailers leads very naturally into abuses of many flavors, from small humiliations to hideous crimes. Every year, guards at Danbury and other women's prisons around the country are caught sexually abusing prisoners. Several years after I came home, one of Danbury's lieutenants, a 17-year corrections veteran, was one of them. He was prosecuted and spent 1 month in jail. When Mr. Maple was on duty in the evening, he constantly patrolled the dorms. There was something unnerving to me about the male COs seeing me in nothing but my muumuu, billowing though it was. It was more unnerving still when I would look up from changing after the gym, in shorts and a sports bra, to see the eyes of a prison guard. It wasn't so much the idea of them seeing my body, although the thought made me recoil. It was more the idea that my intimate moments, changing clothes, lying in bed, reading, crying, were all, in fact, public, available for observation by these strange men. On one of his early days on duty, Maple was running through mail call. Platty, Rivera, Montgomery, Platty, Esposito, Piper. I stepped up and he handed me my mail, and I turned back to the crowd to rejoin it. Some of the women were tittering and whispering. I stood next to Annette and looked at her quizzically. He called you Piper. Other prisoners were looking at me with curiosity. It wasn't done. I felt embarrassed and showed it by flushing deeply, which provoked more tittering. He just doesn't know. He thinks it's my last name, I explained defensively. The next day at mail call, he did it again. That's her first name, some wise-ass said pointedly, as I blushed again. Is it? He asked. That's unusual. Still, he kept calling me Piper. Chapter 9. Mothers and Daughters. Mother's Day was off the chain at the camp. From the moment we awoke, every woman wished another Happy Mother's Day, repeatedly. I quickly gave up explaining that I had no children and just said, Happy Mother's Day to you. About 80% of the women in U.S. prisons have children, so odds were I was right. A lot of women had crocheted long-stem red roses for their prison mamas or friends. Some women organized themselves into somewhat formalized family relationships with other prisoners, especially mother-daughter pairs. There were a lot of little clans at Danbury. The younger women relied on their moms for advice, attention, food, commissary loans, affection, guidance, even discipline. If one of the younger ones was misbehaving, she might get directed by another irritated prisoner, "Go talk to your mama and work your shit out." Or if the kid was really out of control with her mouth or her radio or whatever, the mama might get the request, "You need to talk to your daughter, 'cause if she don't get some act right, I'm gonna knock her out." My de facto prison family revolved around Pop. It exemplified the complex ways that family trees grow behind bars, like topiaries trained into very odd shapes. My immediate sibling was Tony, the Newtown driver who had replaced Nina as Pop's bunkie. By automatic extension, Rose-Marie, Tony's best buddy, was another sibling. I thought of them as the Italian twins. But Pop had many other children, including Big Boo Clemens, the even bigger Angelina Lewis, and Yvonne, who worked with Pop in the kitchen. I took a particular liking to Yvonne. We called each other the sister I never wanted. All of Pop's black daughters called her Mama. All of the white ones called her Pop. She didn't have any Spanish daughters, though she did have Spanish pals from her own peer group. Motherhood in prison was revered but also complicated by separation, guilt, and shame. To my eye, my fellow prisoners were mostly ordinary poor or middle-class mommies, grandmas, and even great-grandmothers. And yet some of them were serving very long sentences, 5 years, 7 years, 12 years, 15 years. I knew that by virtue of being in the minimum security camp, they were unlikely to have been convicted of violent crimes. As I watched my neighbors, young women who lacked even a high school education, with their children in the visiting room, I found myself asking again and again in my head, what could she possibly have done to warrant being locked up here for so long? Criminal masterminds they were not. In the 3 months since my arrival in Danbury, I had seen a number of pregnant women become mothers. In February, young Doris was the vessel of my first prison nativity. I had never seen a woman in labor before, and was both mesmerized and horrified to watch Doris enter a zone in which her body and her baby were taking over, regardless of surroundings. To my fascination, the population of the camp snapped to attention and stepped in to help her as much as anyone could. She had a half-dozen surrogate midwives hovering over her at any given moment, checking to see what she needed, coaching her on how to get more comfortable, relating stories of their own labors and reporting on her progress to an anxious audience of prisoners. The staff certainly wasn't paying much attention to what was happening. Prison births were no big deal to them. It was Doris's first child, and all she wanted to do was curl up in her bunk, which apparently was not a good thing for her or the baby struggling to be born. Older women took turns walking with her up and down the long main hall of the camp, talking to her gently, telling stories and cracking jokes. Observing keenly was Doris's roommate, also heavy with her first child and due any day. They both looked scared. The next morning, as the contractions were growing closer, Doris was taken off to the hospital in handcuffs. In many places in the United States, pregnant female prisoners are kept chained in shackles during their deliveries, a brutal and barbaric practice, though this was not the case for poor Doris. After many hours of labor, she gave birth to a 9-pound baby boy in Danbury Hospital, and was brought back to prison immediately, pale and drawn and sad. Her mother took the baby back to the rural outpost where she lived, 8 hours away. There wasn't much chance that the new arrival would see his father anytime soon. Doris told me that her baby's daddy had just been picked up on 3 outstanding warrants. Fortunately, she was due to go home within the year. I hadn't witnessed anything at Danbury to allay my fear of childbirth, but for the first time I had some tiny insight on the mother-child relationship. The single most reliable way to get another prisoner to smile was to ask her about her children. There were always families in the visiting room. This was both the best and the worst thing about the many hours I spent there. Young children were growing up while their mothers did time, trying to have a relationship via 15-minute phone calls and the hours spent in visitation. I never saw these women look happier than when they were with their children, playing with the small collection of plastic toys kept in the corner and sharing Fritos and Raisinets from the vending machine. When visiting hours were over, it was gut-wrenching to watch the goodbyes. In 1 year, a child could change from a squirming baby to a boisterous, talkative toddler, and mothers would watch football championships and prom nights come and go from the distant sidelines, along with their children's graduations, wedding days, and funerals. As tough as it could be for a prisoner to visit with her children, it was also hard for parents to see their babies locked up. There were so many young girls among us, 18 and 19 years old. Some of these kids had been heading to a place like Danbury for some time, but one bad decision could suddenly land a young woman in a merciless and inflexible system. A lack of priors and a history of general good conduct didn't matter at all. Federal mandatory minimums dictated sentences, and if you were pleading guilty, the vast majority of us did, the only person with real leeway in determining what kind of time you would do was your prosecutor, not your judge. Consequently, there were sad-looking parents visiting their kids, though not mine. My mother was like a ray of sunshine in that room. For our visits every week, my mother was always dressed immaculately in soft, cheerful colors, with her blonde hair carefully styled, her makeup perfectly applied, wearing a piece of jewelry that I had given her for a distant Christmas or birthday. We would talk for hours about my brother, her students, my uncles and aunts, the family dog. I would fill her in on whatever new electrician's skill I'd learned that week. She always seemed perfectly comfortable in the visiting room, and every time she visited, I got comments from other prisoners afterward. "Your mama is so nice. You're a lucky girl." Or, "That's your mother? Get out. I thought it was your sister." I had been hearing that one most of my adult life. People would often say it to her as well, and even though she had received that compliment approximately 3,000 times before, it always made her glow. In the past, this familiar exchange made me feel resentful. Do I look like I'm in my late 40s or 50s? But now, I enjoyed watching her pleasure when people drew a close comparison between us. Even with this disaster I had dragged us all into, she was still proud to be my mother. It occurred to me that I had never seen my mother defeated, even when life presented difficulties and disappointments. I hoped that our resemblance extended beyond our blue eyes. My father, more than 1,000 miles away, was able to come visit me when the academic year was over. His relief when he saw me was palpable. I have always been a daddy's girl, and I could tell how it pained him to see his baby, even a baby in her 30s, in a place like this. We still enjoyed our time, eating peanut M&Ms while I spun all the intrigues of the place out for him to absorb. The difference between our weekly phone calls and an actual in-person conversation was like a text message versus a weekend-long visit. If there was a silver lining to this whole mess, it was the reminder of my family's greatness. I had a lovely visit with my mother that Mother's Day, although the visiting room was deranged. I had never seen it so crowded with large family groups. A lot of women in Danbury had families who lacked the resources to come and visit often, even though many of them lived in New York City. Tired grandmas and aunties, taking care of their daughters' or sisters' children during their prison stays, had a very hard time marshaling toddlers and teenagers on the buses, trains, and taxis necessary to get to Danbury. The trip could take 4 hours each way from the city and cost money. But Mother's Day was special, and children of every age swarmed the place, and a cacophony of conversations flowed in many languages and accents. In the midst of it all was my mother, smiling happily when she spotted me walking into the madness. 2 copies of The New Yorker arrived for me at mail call, to my horror. Someone out there had sent me a second subscription. Miss Esposito from C-Dorm also got the magazine and had been mad at me when my first copy showed up in March. She thought it was a waste of money for both of us to get it. The damn things were piling up all over the prison. Esposito was an odd duck. A big, solid woman in her 50s, she wore her dark hair in a disconcertingly girlish Dutch boy bob. She was always part of the welcome wagon for any new prisoner, regardless of race. She herself was Italian-American. She volunteered that she had been a gang leader with the Latin Kings, a claim I was at first skeptical about. Why would the Latin Kings have an Italian queen? But it turned out to be true. She was a former 1960s radical intellectual who'd gotten involved with gang activity at a pretty high regional level. Esposito was doing a long, long sentence. I could tell pretty quickly that Esposito, although a needy person, wasn't after anything from me that I wasn't willing to give, and she was heartwarmingly appreciative of my magazines and books. One day, she came to me with a fan in her hand. It was a medium-sized oscillating plastic table fan, like you might buy in Woolworths. It looked just like the one Natalie had. "Bunky, you going to be glad we got this when summer comes," she said. "You can't get these no more. They stopped selling them at the commissary." The commissary now sold a much smaller fan, a crappy little one that cost $21.80. The old-school ones were prized, especially by the older ladies, who seemed to feel the heat most acutely. Esposito's fan was broken. It wasn't even hot out yet, but she was stressed. "Can you maybe take a look at this? Down in the electric shop? I'll do anything to get it fixed." "No promises, but sure," was my reply. I toted the thing down to work on the bus the next morning and took it apart, with my co-workers observing keenly. It turned out to be an easy fix, and I was glad that my access to tools was helpful to another prisoner. Back in the camp, when I triumphantly plugged the fan in and it whirred to life, Esposito almost fainted with joy. I refused to take any commissary payment, but Esposito paid me in reputation. Almost immediately, another old-timer approached me, hoping for a board to slide under the mattress to help ease her back pain. There were a handful of older ladies doing very long sentences: Pop, Esposito, Mrs. Jones. And if I did one of them a favor, they were sure to tell everyone. Soon I was besieged by women bearing broken radios and broken fans and seeking repair for things in their cubicles, hooks for their clothing, loose conduits, busted shoe racks, all sorts of things. Little Janet thought this was over the line. "That stuff's not our job, Piper. It's not electric, so why should we fix it?" "No one else is going to do it, babe. The feds aren't going to take care of us in this shithole. We have to do for each other." She could accept that logic. And besides, she had other things on her mind at the moment. Little Janet had attracted an admirer, a tiny little white girl named Amy with a loud mouth. Amy was new among the always-present subset of prisoners I called M&Mlets, Caucasian girls from the wrong side of the tracks with big mouths and big attitudes, who weren't taking shit from anyone except the men in their lives. They had thinly plucked eyebrows, cornrowed hair, hip-hop vocabularies, and baby daddies, and they thought Paris Hilton was the ne plus ultra of feminine beauty. Amy was the tiniest and the most obnoxious of the new crop of M&Mlets, and she was smitten with little Janet, who, despite her 2-year tenure in prison, seemed to have no idea how to handle a middle school crush. Little Janet did not mess with girls, so Amy was barking up the wrong tree. Little Janet wasn't so mean that she'd ice Amy. She tolerated her puppyish worship. When Amy got assigned to the electric shop, though, Janet had to lay down the law. If Amy didn't stop writing her MASH notes and acting like a lovelorn cow, little Janet would stop talking to her. Amy seemed dejected, but resigned. My read on the situation was that Amy was not, in fact, a lesbian, and that this was basically a schoolgirl crush. I took one for the team, taking pity on Janet by taking Amy away with me on some of the housekeeping errands. I would not deny a fix-it request, even from someone I didn't like. We must have hung 100 extra cubicle hooks, which we would make out of C-clamps with a hammer, Amy spluttering and cursing the entire time. Despite her foul little mouth and frequent tantrums, I found within myself a surprising reserve of patience for Amy and adopted a mild but firm approach. She was kind of like a sweet tart, sugary but also puckeringly sour. No one else was showing her any positive attention. Amy reacted with undying allegiance to me, loudly alternating between calling me her mom and her wife, both of which caused me to snort with mock outrage. "Amy, I am not old enough to be your mother, and as for the other, you're not my type." Being helpful did make us more popular, and I got a lot more smiles and nods around the camp, which made me a little less shy. After almost 4 months in prison, I was still cautious, super cautious, and kept most people at arm's length. Many times I fielded the sly question, "What is the all-American girl doing in a place like this?" Everyone assumed I was doing time on a financial crime, but actually I was like the vast majority of the women there, a non-violent drug offender. I did not make a secret of it, as I knew I had lots of company. In the federal system alone, a fraction of the U.S. prison population, there were over 90,000 prisoners locked up for drug offenses, compared with about 40,000 for violent crimes. A federal prisoner costs at least $30,000 a year to incarcerate, and females actually cost more. Most of the women in the camp were poor, poorly educated, and came from neighborhoods where the mainstream economy was barely present, and the narcotics trade provided the most opportunities for employment. Their typical offenses were for things like low-level dealing, allowing their apartments to be used for drug activity, serving as couriers, and passing messages, all for low wages. Small involvement in the drug trade could land you in prison for many years, especially if you had a lousy court-appointed lawyer. Even if you had a great legal aid lawyer, he or she was guaranteed to have a staggering caseload and limited resources for your defense. It was hard for me to believe that the nature of our crimes was what accounted for my 15-month sentence versus some of my neighbors' much lengthier ones. I had a fantastic private attorney and a country club suit to go with my blonde bob. Compared to the drug offenders, the white-collar criminals had often demonstrated a lot more avarice, though their crimes were rarely glamorous. Bank fraud, insurance fraud, credit card scams, check kiting. One raspy-voiced 50-ish blonde was in for stock fraud. She liked to keep me up to speed on her children's misadventures in boarding school. A former investment banker had embezzled money to support her gambling habit, and marriage-minded Rose Marie was doing 54 months for internet auction fraud. I gleaned this information about people's crimes either because they'd volunteered it or because another prisoner told me. Some people would discuss their offense matter-of-factly, like Esposito or Rose Marie. Others would never utter a word. I still had absolutely no idea why Natalie had been sentenced to 8 years in this snake pit. We got along well, and some evenings would spend companionable time together in our cube. I would sit on my bunk, reading or writing letters, while Natalie listened to her radio below. She would announce, "Bunky, I'm going to get in my bed, listen to my music, and relax." Every Sunday, we cleaned the cube together. We would use her irreplaceable plastic basin filled with warm water and laundry soap. She cleaned the floor with one of her special rags taken from the kitchen, while I did the walls and the ceiling with maxi pads from the box that sat in the bathroom, getting all the dust and grime off of the slanting metal I-beams and the sprinkler system that ran over my bed. Then we would fix my bed together. No one who has been down a long time will let the junior bunkie make the bed, as I had been schooled on my first day. I grew powerfully attached to Natalie in just a short time. She was very kind to me, and I could tell that being her bunkie conferred on me an odd credibility among other prisoners. But despite, or because of the fact that we lived in the closest of quarters, I knew virtually nothing about her, just that she was from Jamaica and that she had 2 children, a daughter and a young son. That was really it. When I asked Natalie whether she had started her time down the hill in the FCI, she just shook her head. "No, bunkie. Back in the day, things were a little different. I went down there for a little while, and it was nothing nice." That was all I was going to get. It was clear that where Natalie was concerned, personal subjects were off limits, and I had to respect that. But in a world of women confined to such close quarters, juicy stories and secrets had a way of leaking out, either because the prisoner in question had at some point taken a blabberer into her confidence, or because the staff had done the blabbing. Of course, staff is not supposed to discuss personal information with other prisoners, but it happened all the time. Certain stories had a lot of currency. Francesca LaRue, a vicious and crazy Jesus freak in B-dorm, had been disfigured by extreme plastic surgery. A bizarre sight with balloon-like breasts, duck lips, and even ass implants, she was rumored to have performed illegitimate backroom cosmetic surgery procedures and to have injected people with transmission fluid to dissolve cellulite. I suspected the truth was plain old medical fraud. A clever and manipulative middle-aged blonde was rumored to have stolen tens of millions of dollars in an elaborate fraud scheme. One elderly lady had barely got her walker through the door before it spread like wildfire that she had embezzled big money from her synagogue. Most viewed this with disapproval. "You can't steal from a church." Any story you heard from another prisoner had to be taken with about a pound of salt. Think about it. Put this many women in a confined space. Give them little to do and a lot of time. What else can you expect? Still, true or not, gossip helped pass the time. Pop had the best gossip, the most historical and revealing. It was from her that I found out why Natalie had been sent down to the FCI all those years ago. She had thrown scalding water on another prisoner in the kitchen. I was incredulous. Bitch was fucking with her, and what you don't know, Piper, is your bunkie's got a temper. It was very difficult to reconcile that kind of rage and aggression with my quiet, dignified bunkie, who treated me so kindly. In Pop's words, though, Natalie's no joke. Seeing how puzzled and disturbed I was by this new facet of Natalie, Pop tried to illuminate some prison realities for me. "Look, Piper, things are pretty calm around here now, but that's not always the way. Sometimes shit jumps off. And down the hill, forget about it. Some of those bitches are animals. Plus, you've got lifers down there. You've got your little year to do, and I know it seems hard to you. But when you're doing serious time or life, things look different. You can't put up with shit from anyone because this is your life, and if you ever take it from anyone, then you're always going to have problems. There was this woman down the hill I used to know. Little woman, very quiet, kept to herself, didn't bother nobody. This woman was doing life. She did her work. She walked the track down there. She went to bed early. That's it. Then some young girl shows up down there. This girl was trouble. She starts in with this little woman. She's giving her shit. She's hassling her all the time. She's a fucking stupid kid. Well, that little woman, who never said boo to no one, put 2 locks in a sock, and she let that girl know what time it was. I never seen anything like it. This girl was a mess, blood everywhere. She was fucked up good. But you know what, Piper? That's where we are. And we're not all in the same boat. So just remember that. When Pop told me a story like this one, I would hang on every word. I had no way of verifying whether it was gospel truth or not. Like most things I heard in prison, but I understood that these stories held their own accuracy. They described our world as it was and as we experienced it. Their lessons always proved invaluable and inviolable. Mercifully, the closest I got to fighting did not involve a slock, the formal name for a weapon made out of a combination lock inside a tube sock, but rather roughage. Whenever something other than cauliflower and iceberg lettuce appeared on the salad bar, I went to town. One day, there was a bunch of spinach mixed in with the iceberg, and I happily began to select dark green leaves for my dinner. I hummed a little melody under my breath, trying to tune out the din of the dining hall. But as I carefully plucked the spinach, avoiding the lettuce, words began to emerge out of the noise, near my ear. "Hey, hey, hey, you! Stop picking! Stop picking in that!" I turned around to see where the shouting was coming from and at whom it was directed. To my surprise, a beefy young girl in a hairnet was glaring at me. I looked around, then gestured with the salad tongs. "Are you talking to me?" "Hell yeah! You can't be picking out the greens like that. Just fill up your plate and keep moving." I looked at my salad bar adversary, wondering who the fuck she thought she was. I vaguely recognized her as New, a reputed troublemaker up in the rooms. Just the other day, Annette, who was still stuck up there, had been complaining about the disrespectful mouth on this 18-year-old kid. I knew from Pop that the salad bar was among the least desirable kitchen jobs, because so much washing and chopping was involved in the prep. So it was usually done by the low woman on the culinary totem pole. I was furious that she had had the nerve to step to me. By now I felt like I was pretty firmly established in the camp's social ecology. I didn't mess with other people, I was friendly but respectful, and hence other people treated me with respect. So to have some kid giving me shit in the dining hall was enraging. Not only that, but she was breaking a cardinal rule among prisoners. Don't you tell me what to do. You have 8 numbers after your name just like me. To get into a public battle with a black woman was a profoundly loaded situation. But it didn't even occur to me to back down from this punk kid. I opened my mouth, mad enough to spit, and said loudly, "I don't eat iceberg lettuce." Really? I asked myself. That's what you're going to throw down with? "I don't care what you eat. Just don't be picking in there." Suddenly I realized that things had quieted down quite a bit in the dining hall, and that this unusual conflict was being watched. All clashes between prisoners were sporting events, but for me to be in the mix was freakish. I was transported back to my middle school's parking lot when Tanya Kateris had called me out, and I knew that the only choice was to fight or prove to every person in school that I was chicken shit. In suburban Massachusetts, I went with chicken shit. Here, that just wasn't an option. But before I could even draw breath to assert myself with Big Mouth and raise the stakes, Jay, my friend from work in B-dorm, materialized at my side. Her normally smiling face was stern. I looked at her. She looked at Big Mouth, not saying a word. And just like that, Big Mouth turned and slunk away. "You okay, Piper?" said Jay. "I am totally okay, Jay," I replied hotly, glaring after Big Mouth. Disappointed, everyone turned back to their food, and the volume went right back up to its usual level. I knew that Jay had just saved me many months of trouble. Now that I had my headset radio, I couldn't believe how much easier it was to carve some enjoyment out of the day. With a pair of white sneakers purchased from commissary, I began jogging around the track every evening. I could tune out the pandemonium of B-dorm at will, and go much farther around the quarter-mile track now that I had music in my ear. Rosemarie tipped me off to WXCI 91.7, the radio station of Western Connecticut State University. I had forgotten about the pleasures of college radio, the exquisite randomness of what got played, the 20-minute between-songs banter of 19-year-olds, the smack of music I'd never heard against my brain cavity. I was in heaven as I went around and around that track, giggling at sophomoric radio skits about Dick Cheney and listening to the new bands like the Kings of Leon that I'd been reading about in my copies of Spin but had never actually heard in the endless repeat of classic rock versus hip-hop versus Spanish radio that is the soundtrack of daily life in prison. Best of all was a recurring weekly show, 90s Mixtape, which compiled the best songs from every year of the 1990s, 1 year every week. The 1991 Top 10 included Pavement, NWA, Naughty by Nature, Teenage Fan Club, Blur, Metallica, Nirvana, and LL Cool J. Those songs made me think of Larry and of the trouble-seeking girl I had been when they were first released. Running around the track, I relived every song I had heard in the background when I was running around the globe. A careless and ignorant young girl, launching myself into trouble so deep that it put me on this prison gravel 11 years later. No matter how stupid, how pointless, how painful my current situation was, as I listened to Mixtape every week, I couldn't deny the love I still felt for that reckless, audacious fool who was still me, if only in my mind. May 17th was Larry's and my anniversary. The wretched fact that we were separated and it was all my fault was impossible to deny. But when I found the right Hallmark greeting in the free collection handed out via the chapel, I felt a tiny bit better. This is you, baby, such a fine black man, who knows who he is and knows where he stands, who doesn't have time to play any games, who's earned my respect and gives back the same, who gives of himself to build up trust and commits his heart to big dreams for us, who can heat me up and then love me down, and within his arms all my joy is found. And on the inside, this is you, baby, such a fine black man. This is me loving you, hard as I can. Joking aside, the sentiment was all true. I spent an evening in my bunk composing what I would write on the card. It was our 8th anniversary of dating. I told him how quickly that time had passed, a quarter of our lives spent together. How all the risky choices we had taken together were the right ones, and how I couldn't wait to come home to him, the only man for me. I promised to keep counting sunrises until I could be where he was, anywhere that might be. One day, when we got to work, DeSimon stepped out of his office and locked the door. "Today we're going to practice with the lift," he announced. What the hell did that mean? The lift turned out to be a mechanical hydraulic lift. I tried to figure out what it might be used for. All of the buildings were pretty low-lying, and the FCI itself was only a few stories tall. DeSimon shed some light on my question. There were a handful of area lights around the grounds that were hundreds of feet high. The lift was used when a bulb or fixture on one of them needed attention. "Oh, hell no," said Jay, who was trying to get transferred to the warehouse. "No motherfucking way are you getting me up on that." The rest of the crew were in agreement with her. But we still had to go through the elaborate process of setting up the lift properly. Essentially a metal platform a few square feet with a railing that went straight up in the sky when you pressed a button. If you screwed up one of the safety measures, it was easy to imagine the splat on concrete. When we had finally done it properly, DeSimon said, "Who wants a ride?" A few intrepids, Amy, little Janet, Levy, climbed onto the platform and pushed the button, each stopping long before the lift reached its full height, then coming down. Scary. I want to try. I climbed onto the platform, and DeSimon handed me the control button. Up, up, up. My heart beat hard as I left the concrete behind, the faces of 6 women in a beard upturned to watch me. Higher, higher. I could see everywhere, for miles farther than I had imagined beyond the confines of the prison. Maybe I could see my future from up here. The entire platform was swaying in the breeze as I kept my finger on the button. I wanted to go all the way up, even though I was clutching the railing with white knuckles and the blood was pounding in my ears. At its highest extension, the lift stopped with a jerk, scaring me even more. A little half-cheer rose from my co-workers, who were shading their eyes to see me. Women were coming out of the other shops to have a look. "She crazy," I heard someone say admiringly. I peered over the railing that I was clinging to, grinning. Mr. DeSimon appeared to be trying to hide a smile in his beard. "Come on down, Kerman. No one wants to clean you off the concrete." I almost liked him that day. The place was emptying out. Early in the month, there was a rush of new faces, including a clique that had smuggled in marijuana via the Coochie Express. Squat and cough doesn't really seem to work. And brought a flurry of shakedowns into the entire camp. But then the flow of new prisoners seemed to stop abruptly. The prevailing rumor was that the BOP had closed the camp, accepting only prisoners who were already doing time in other facilities, because they didn't want Martha Stewart designated to Danbury. Unclear was whether this was because the place was a broken-down dump, or for some other more sinister reason. The moratorium on new prisoners seemed real, because the flow of new faces slowed to a feeble trickle. But people kept leaving to go home. I wished that I was leaving. The adrenaline of the initial "can I do this" period was definitely over, and the rest of my time in Danbury stretched ahead of me. Larry and I had spent much time and energy hoping to get my sentence down to a year, feeling like that would be a victory. Now I was in the midst of it, and the months felt like they would never end. Still, the novelties of prison socializing could distract me. Jay, like many of my favorite people, was a Taurus, a fact I learned when Big Boo Clemens approached me in B-Dorm to invite me to Jay's birthday party. Big Boo was a giant bulldyke. When I say giant, I mean at least 300 pounds. She had skin like a Dove ice cream bar, and was the most attractive 300-pound woman I have ever seen. She used her massive bulk to intimidate, but her girth was less daunting than her wit. She had a lightning-sharp way with words. She was the resident rhyme master, and her charisma and charm were undeniable. Her girlfriend, Trina, at 200 pounds, was pretty but a bitch on wheels, and was commonly referred to by other prisoners as Pie Face, but only behind her back. She loved to argue, was as disagreeable as Boo was smooth. Boo told me the day and time when the party would take place, and that I could bring a cheesecake. "Where's the party?" I asked, and was surprised when she said, "Right here in B-Dorm." Prison parties were usually held in the common rooms. Otherwise, you risked being hassled by the guards. When Jay's birthday arrived, I wondered how she felt. This must have been her 2nd or 3rd birthday in prison, and she had 7 more stretching in front of her like hurdles on a very long track. I turned up for the party promptly after dinner, cheesecake in hand. It was the only prison cuisine I knew how to make. The party guests gathered in the middle corridor of B-Dorm outside Jay's cube, which she shared with her bunkie Sheena. B-Dorm residents made up most of the guests, and we pulled up the folding chairs and stools from our cubes. My neighbor, Bipolar Colleen, was there, and so were Jay's buddy Bobby, the biker mama from back in the Brooklyn MCC, little Janet, Amy, and Lily Cabrales, who I had observed in action on my first morning in B-Dorm. Lily almost drove me insane when I first moved in, as she would call out across the room again and again, "Pookie, what you doing? Pookie, come over here. Pookie, do you got any noodle soups? I'm so hungry." Pookie was her very quiet special friend, who lived 2 cubicles over from me. I would sit on my bunk and ask myself, and sometimes Natalie, will she ever shut up? Lily was a loud-ass Bronx Puerto Rican gay-for-the-stay, don't-fuck-with-me piece of work. But a funny thing happened, especially after Pookie went home and Lily quieted down a bit. She began to grow on me. I guess maybe I grew on her, too, until we got to the point where she nicknamed me Dolphin after my tattoo, and I could get a big smile out of her with a little joke. Delicious, the cheerful titty admirer, was there. She played spades with Jay. Delicious might have been my old friend Candace's doppelganger. This may seem surprising, as Candace is a North Carolinian white Dartmouth grad who is a high-powered technology PR maven on the West Coast, mother of 1 and a clown enthusiast, whereas Delicious is a black D.C. native with a 5 o'clock shadow, a bunch of tattoos, and unusually long nails, who worked as a prison dishwasher while sharpening her excellent singing voice and off-the-cuff witticisms. But they had similar hair, similar stature, the identical button nose, and the same mellow with a touch of hyper way of looking at the world. It gave me goosebumps. Delicious sang all the time. All the time. She would rather sing than speak. As soon as I got to B-dorm, she asked me, "Y'all got any gangsta books?" When I told her about my friend Candace on the outside and how they were like twins, Delicious looked at me as if I were the weirdest person she had ever met. For the party, Boo had prepared a game for us to play. She made up a rhyme that was a riddle about every invitee, and the game was to guess the identity of the riddle's subject. This was an irresistible novelty, and soon we were laughing at each other, although Boo had refrained from being really mean at anyone's expense. She lives right here, between you and me, and when you see her, you think of the sea. When Boo read that rhyme, I had to bite my lip to hide my smile while I looked around quickly. Most people looked confused, but a few were smirking, pleased with themselves for getting it right away. "Who is it?" asked Boo. A lot of shoulders were shrugging, which irked her. "It's Piper!" shouted Sheena and Amy in triumphant unison. "I don't get it," Trina pouted at her girlfriend. "That don't make no sense." Boo was exasperated. "She lives right here between you and me. That means she lives in B-dorm. And when you see her, you think of the sea. That's her tattoo. Get it? See? The fish?" "Ah, yeah," Lily Cabrales grinned. "That's my dolphin." Chapter 10. Schooling the OG. I had learned a lot since arriving in prison 5 months ago. How to clean house using maxi pads, how to wire a light fixture, how to discern whether a duo were best friends or girlfriends, when to curse someone in Spanish, knowing the difference between feelin' it, good, and feelin' some kind of way, bad, the fastest way to calculate someone's good time, how to spot a commissary hoe a mile away, and how to tell which guards were players and which guards were nothin' nice. I even mastered a recipe from the prison's culinary canon: cheesecake. I made my first effort at cooking for someone's going-home party, preparing a prison cheesecake according to my co-worker Yvette's Spanish and hand gesture instructions. Unlike a lot of prison cookery, most of the necessary ingredients could be bought at the commissary. Prison cheesecake. 1. Prepare a crust of crushed graham crackers mixed with 4 pats of margarine stolen from the dining hall. Bake it in a Tupperware bowl for about a minute in the microwave, and allow it to cool and harden. 2. Take 1 full round of Laughing Cow cheese, smash it with a fork, and mix with a cup of vanilla pudding until smooth. Gradually mix in 1 whole container of cremora, even though it seems gross. Beat viciously until smooth. Add lemon juice from the squeeze bottle until the mixture starts to stiffen. Note, this will use most of the plastic lemon. 3. Pour into the bowl atop the crust, and put on ice in your Bunky's cleaning bucket to chill until ready to eat. It was a little squishy the first time. I should have used more lemon juice, but it was a great success. Yvette raised her eyebrows when she tasted it. "Buena!" she proclaimed. I was very proud. Prison cuisine and survival techniques were all well and good, but it was time to learn something more productive. Pleasantly but persistently, Yoga Janet had been inviting me to join her class, and when I wrenched my back, she iced it while I lay prone on my bunk. "You really should learn yoga with us," she gently chided me. "Running is too hard on the body." I wasn't going to give up the track, but I started descending to the little gym for yoga class several times a week. Larry laughed when I told him. He had been trying to get me to try yoga at a fancy downtown studio for years, and he found it both entertaining and annoying that it had taken incarceration to get me into Downward Dog. The Fieldhouse gym had a rubber floor. At first, we used undersized blue foam mats, but with great effort and persistence, Yoga Janet got proper orange yoga mats donated to the camp from the outside. Tall and calm and down-to-earth, Janet managed to create the sense that she was teaching us something important and valuable without taking herself too seriously. Camilla from B-Dorm was always there. Alongside all the many misfit toys at Danbury, Camilla was instantly noticeable. My friend Eric spotted her in the visiting room and declared her the hottest woman in prison in America, no offense to you, Pipes. She glowed with health and radiated beauty. Tall, slim, with a glossy black mane, tawny brown skin, a pointed chin, and huge dark eyes, she was always laughing, loudly. I was drawn to her willingness to laugh, but that very quality was the subject of derision among some of the white women. "Those Puerto Ricans, it's like they don't even know they're in jail. They're always laughing and dancing like idiots," sneered tall, mopey Sally, who wanted everyone to be as miserable as she was. And as ignorant. Camilla was Colombian, not Puerto Rican. Camilla was a natural at yoga, easily mastering warrior poses and back bends, and giggling helplessly with me as we tried to balance on one leg while twisting the other around it. On the mat next to Camilla would be Gada. Gada was one of the handful of Muslim women I met in prison. It was difficult to guess her age. Her face was deeply creased, but she had an air of tremendous vitality. She might be in her 50s or 60s. Her hair was salt and pepper, and she hid it under makeshift headscarves, sometimes a pillowcase, sometimes a contraband cloth napkin. I never quite got the story straight, but it seemed that the guards frequently confiscated her headscarves. We were not allowed to wear do-rags when in uniform, only commissary-purchased baseball caps or prison-issue wool knit caps that itched like hell. I thought surely there should be some exception for Muslim women. I could never figure out if I was mistaken and the hijab was forbidden in the prison system, or if Gada just couldn't get it together to obtain a prison-approved headscarf. She wasn't much for rules. Gada was from Lebanon, but had lived in South America for many years and so was fluent in Spanish, with pretty tenuous English. Because of her long residence in Latin America, Gada was an honorary Spanish mommy. This was a good thing because she was totally unaccepting of the authority of the staff and uninterested in the institution's rules, and only the monumental efforts of her friends to protect her from the consequences of that indifference kept her out of the SHU. This won her both annoyance and respect from her fellow prisoners. No one seemed to know what Gada was down for, but we could all agree that she was another OG. Gada loved Yoga Janet, which was the primary reason she came to class. She was not all that interested in doing the poses properly, but she brought great enthusiasm to the ritual. The final member of our ragtag band of aspiring yogis was Sister Platy, who took proper form very seriously. Sister had tight hips, so twists and pigeon pose prompted a knitted brow, and if she had indulged in the greasy home fries at the midday meal, the forward bends would give her trouble. When I sank into a deep lunge, the tiny nun would study me, plaintively wondering, what am I doing wrong? The 5 of us had a camaraderie that made those few hours among the most enjoyable of the week. Every class, we would meet to claim the peace that, at Danbury, could only be found within one's own body. Each session ended with Janet's final relaxation, when she spoke soothingly to us of the work we had just completed, and the things we had to be grateful for every day, together in prison. And every single week, Gara would fall asleep within minutes during final relaxation, snoring loudly until someone woke her. One evening, Miss Mahoney, the cheerful education administrator from down the hill, made a lot of people very happy. Miss Mahoney was one of the few prison staffers who seemed to be on our side. As near as I could tell, she was one of the education department's few saving graces. She did have an annoying habit of trying to be down on the mic when she was on the PA system. On this particular evening, she announced that a gender awareness class would be offered in the dining hall. What exactly was going to be conveyed there was unclear. Then she got to the important matters. Would the following ladies please report to the CO's office for their GED test results? And you could just tell from her voice that the news was good for every name called. "Malcolm!" Mahoney called. I jumped out of my bunk. Natalie had taken the GED test approximately a dozen times and was definitely way past due to pass it. She got nervous during the testing, and time and again the maths section had proved her bête noire. Where was Natalie? When I got to the main hall, there were already screams of joy, and women were pouring out of all the rooms and dorms. When a woman of 25, 35, 45 has struggled to earn her high school diploma in prison, taking pretest after pretest and trying to learn in a poorly run program and classes full of every imaginable delinquent student behavior, and then actually passes, it is a victory. Some of these women had dropped out of school 30 years before, and were finally getting one of the only positive things, one of the only measures of achievement one can earn in prison. Plus, it meant that these women could finally earn above the lowest pay grade at their prison jobs. If you didn't have your GED, you couldn't earn over 14 cents an hour, which was barely enough to pay for toothpaste and soap. Everything came out of our prison accounts: hygiene items, phone calls, fines. If a prisoner didn't have her GED and didn't have money coming in from outside, she was screwed. Natalie had toiled for many years as a skilled baker in that prison kitchen, a treasured member of the cooking staff, and yet she could never be paid more than $5.60 a week for 40 hours of work. Where was Miss Natalie? Her name had been called 5 minutes ago, but I didn't see her in the throng of jubilant, shouting, laughing women in the hall. Where was my enigmatic Bunky, that supremely self-possessed woman? I knew how badly Natalie wanted that diploma. I suspected it hurt her that she had struggled for so long to pass that math section. With embarrassed dignity, she had declined my offers of study help. This was her moment. Could she possibly be hiding, ashamed to join the orgy of congratulations and illegal hugs taking place in the hallway? No, wait, she was down at the track. I had watched her putting on her sneakers. In my flip-flops, I took off down the hall, out the building, and down the stairs to the track at top speed. She didn't even know. Halfway down the stairs, I was calling out to the others on the track, "Is my Bunky down there?" I rounded the field house, and there she was with her crazy friend, Sheila. "Bunky, your GED results are back," I panted. Natalie smiled nervously. "Come up, Bunky. Come up and see." "Okay, Bunky, I'm coming." Ladylike to the end, Natalie did not rush. I started up the stairs as a number of people came down. "Where's Natalie? Where's Miss Malcolm? There she is. Come on, Natalie." My bunkie looked surprised, but she still didn't hurry. She had that look of skepticism on her face, unwilling to give herself over to celebration until she saw its cause with her own eyes. When she entered the camp, an entourage traveling before and behind her, the noise in the hall was deafening, and people were calling out, "Where's Miss Malcolm?" She was immediately enveloped by people hugging and congratulating her. As she made slow progress up the hall, Natalie laughed and smiled and looked overwhelmed. Down near the CO's office, someone was waving her test results in the air. "Natalie, you did it!" I suddenly thought I was going to lose it and start crying right there, and I was not a crier. The release of so much collective happiness in that miserable place was almost too much for me. It was like hot and cold air colliding, creating a tornado right inside the hall. I took a deep breath, stepped back, and watched my bunkie be enveloped by well-wishers. When I congratulated her in the relative privacy of our cube, she tried to downplay her triumph. But I could tell that she was deeply satisfied. The fact that I'd become used to life in prison shocked my friends and family. But no one on the outside can really appreciate the galvanizing effect of all the regimented rituals, whether official or informal. It's the insidious, cruel paradox of lengthy sentences. For women doing 7, 12, 20 years, the only way to survive was to accept prison as their universe. But how on earth would they survive in the outside world when released? Institutionalized was one of the greatest insults one could throw at another prisoner. But when you resisted the systems of control, you suffered swift retribution. Where you fit in and how comfortable you were willing to get depended on the length of your sentence, the amount of contact you had with the outside world, and the quality of your life on the outside. And if you resisted finding a place in prison society, you were desperately lonely and miserable. Mrs. Jones had been in the camp longer than any other prisoner, but would be going home next year. Her cubicle, a puppy program single in the corner of A dorm next to the outside door, was so cozy we all feared what would happen when it came time for her to leave it. "I like this cube. I get all the fresh air I want, plus I can walk the puppies just like that," she cackled. During the day, I liked to drop by Mrs. Jones' cube to play with Inky, the Labrador retriever she was training as a service dog. I would sit on the floor and rub Inky's belly while Mrs. Jones fussed around the cube, showing me photographs of women with whom she had done time, or her latest crochet project. She specialized in Christmas stockings, and asking me if I wanted random objects she had squirreled away during her 15 years in prison. Mrs. Jones spent a lot of time down on the track walking Inky, and she was impressed by my running. She was concerned that she was overweight, so she resolved to start running too. "You and me, we're going to compete," she would crow, poking my shoulder hard. "We'll see what you're made of." But Mrs. Jones was perilously top-heavy, and after wheezing her way around only one lap, she sat on a bench, heaving for breath. I suggested she try speed walking instead. This she found manageable and would huff and puff around all morning at top speed, obsessively. One day Mrs. Jones came to see me in my cube. I was writing letters up in my bunk. She peeked around the particle board like a little girl, which I found disconcerting. "What's up, Mrs. Jones?" "Are you busy?" "Not too busy for you, OG. Come on in." She came closer to the bunk bed and whispered conspiratorially, "I got a favor to ask you." "Shoot." "You know I'm in the college class, right?" The class was a basic business course, taught by a pair of professors who came in from a nearby accredited college. It didn't mean much in terms of getting one closer to a college degree. For that, you needed to pay for correspondence courses. But it did count toward program credit with an inmate's case manager. The case managers were tasked with managing the completion of our sentences, which meant recalculating our good time. We were supposed to serve only 85% of our sentences if we earned good time, collecting fines from our inmate accounts, if you couldn't pay fines, you wouldn't get good time, and assigning our program activity, including mandatory re-entry classes. The programs available to campers were feeble and few. The college class was one of the only options. But after reading over and helping to revise a number of women's homework assignments, I was skeptical about the class's usefulness. Camilla's business plan for a Victoria's Secret competitor, for example, was entertaining but highly hypothetical and totally unrelated to what she might be doing when she got out of this human warehouse in 5 years. "How's it going, Mrs. Jones?" She explained that it was not going so well. She had received a bad grade on her business plan. The OG was worried. "I need a tutor. Will you help me? We have a paper due on a movie we saw. I'll pay you." "Mrs. Jones, you will not pay me anything. Of course I'll help you. Bring me your stuff and let's look at it together." When I agreed to help the OG, I had in mind a typical student-tutor relationship. I would talk to her about her assignments, ask thought-provoking questions, and review and correct her work. She came back with her notebook and papers and a book that she put on my bed. Managing in the Next Society, by Peter Drucker. "What's this?" "Our textbook. You gotta read it." "No, Mrs. Jones, you have to read it." She looked at me, anguished and pleading. "It gives me a headache." I remembered that in addition to being nutty from having been locked up for well over a decade, Mrs. Jones was reputed to have had a few screws knocked loose by her abusive husband. I frowned. "Let's take a look at your paper that's due, the one about the movie." This provoked another anguished look. "You need to write it. I can't do it. They didn't like my last paper," she said, pulling out her business plan, embarrassed. She had received a poor grade in big red pen. I flipped through it. Mrs. Jones's handwriting was hard to read, but I realized that even if her penmanship had been flawless, the contents of the paper made little sense. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. I might be a convicted felon, but as the daughter of teachers, I had a strong aversion to cheating on tests. "Mrs. Jones, I shouldn't write your papers for you. And how am I going to write a paper about a movie I didn't see? I took notes." She thrust them at me triumphantly. Oh, great. It appeared that the movie had had something to do with the Industrial Revolution. Was it better to let Mrs. Jones fail on her own or to help her cheat? I knew I was not going to let her fail. "Oh, gee, why don't I ask you questions about the movie and I'll help you do an outline, and then you can try writing the paper?" Mrs. Jones shook her head stubbornly. "Piper, look at my business plan. I can't write it. If you won't help me, Joni in A dorm said she would do it, but you're smarter than her." Joan Lombardi was hardly a rocket scientist, and I knew she would charge Mrs. Jones for her tutoring. Plus, my ego was involved. I sighed. "Let me see your notes." After extracting a few context-free specifics about the movie from her, I set to work writing an incredibly generic 3-page paper about the Industrial Revolution. When I was finished, I walked the neatly handwritten paper over to the OG's cube in A dorm. She was ecstatic. "Mrs. Jones, you are going to recopy this paper so it's in your handwriting, right?" "Nah, they'll never notice." I wondered what would happen to me if her instructors caught this. I didn't think I'd be sent to the SHU or get expelled from prison. "Mrs. Jones, I want you to at least read the paper so you know what it's about. Do you promise me?" "I swear, Piper, on my honor." Mrs. Jones was beside herself when she got her paper back in class. "An A! We got an A!" She glowed with pride. We got an A on the next film summary as well, and she was jubilant. I couldn't believe that her teachers had no comment or questions about the difference between these papers and her previous one, right down to the different handwriting. Now she grew serious. "We gotta write the final paper. This is 50% of the grade, Piper." "What's the assignment, OG?" "It needs to be a paper on innovation, and it has to be based on the textbook. And it has to be longer. I moaned. I desperately wanted to avoid reading the Peter Drucker book. I had spent my entire educational and professional career avoiding these types of business books, and now they'd caught up to me in prison. I didn't see any way around reading it if the OG were to pass her class. Innovation is a little broad, Mrs. Jones. Any ideas on a more specific topic? She looked at me helplessly. Okay, how about fuel-efficient cars? I suggested. Mrs. Jones had been locked up since the mid-1980s. I tried to explain to her what a hybrid car was. Sounds good, she said. Larry was perplexed when I asked him to put in the mail some basic web articles on hybrids. I tried to explain about the OG's term paper. He was totally swamped, having just started a new job as an editor at Men's Journal. Part of his job negotiations had included securing permission to work a half-day every Thursday or Friday so that he could visit his girl in prison. I tried to imagine what exactly that conversation had been like. The lengths he went to for me were amazing. Soon, I got a packet of information at mail call and started to slog through Managing in the Next Society. Among the last prisoners to show up in May, before the camp was closed to deflect Martha Stewart to another facility, there were 3 new political prisoners, pacifists like Sister Platy. They had been arrested and sent to prison for protesting at the School of the Americas, the U.S. Army Training Center for Latin American military personnel, read Secret Police, Torturers, and Thugs, located in Georgia. These special newbies were pretty much central casting leftists, earnest pale-faces who were willing and eager to sacrifice for their cause, and to discuss it ad nauseum. One of them looked like Mr. Burns from The Simpsons, all watery blue eyes, bad posture, and Adam's apple, and she seemed irritated by her situation. The other was like a young novice in a convent, with shorn hair and a perpetually surprised expression. Then there was Alice, about 5 feet tall with the thickest Coke bottle glasses I had seen in a long time. She was as friendly as the dogs in the puppy program, and as garrulous as her partners were withdrawn. Sometimes they would all join us for yoga class. These 3 made a beeline for Sister Platy and followed her around like ducklings. I thought it was cool that Sister had a posse of pacifists in prison. Yes, the government wasted millions of taxpayer dollars prosecuting and locking up non-violent protesters, but here on the inside, the political prisoners now had a community of like-minded folks. Sister certainly enjoyed their company, discussing theories and tactical strategy for bringing the military-industrial complex to its knees for hours on end in the dining hall. Alice and her co-defendants managed to get jobs teaching in the GED program, the gig I had previously longed for but didn't interest me any longer. I felt guilty about preferring CMS work, but I had been observing the unpleasant developments in the education department and was keeping my distance. Following the mold shutdown of the GED program in the winter, all the tainted books and curriculum materials had been thrown out and were not replaced. The prison had transferred a popular female staff member out of the camp and down the hill. I guess she was too sympathetic to prisoners. In her place, the new head of education in the camp was a mullet-wearing, Trans Am-driving vulgarian. I called him Stumpy, who rumor held had basically flunked out of the Postal Service, only to be picked up by the BOP. He was an inadequate excuse for a teacher, who resorted to and clearly enjoyed threatening and verbally abusing his pupils. He was universally loathed by all campers, and most of all by the inmate tutors who worked for him. According to them, his attitude toward his pupils was simple. I don't care if they never learn that 1 + 1 = 2. I get paid for 8 hours of work. One day, I returned from the electric shop to find the camp in an uproar. Stumpy had been on a serious tear that day in the classroom, more abusive than usual, and Alice the pacifist had finally had it. She wanted to be released from her job as a tutor. Stumpy went ballistic, screaming and ranting and writing her up with a shot for defiance, or resisting a direct order or something along those lines. Pennsatucky, who had been in the classroom, and was probably the object of his initial abuse, said that his dumbass face had turned purple. He had gone storming out of the camp and down the hill. But now rumor had it that he was trying to have Alice locked up in the SHU, and everyone was outraged. Sure enough, after dinner and mail call, we heard the thud of heavy boots and the rattle of chains. Massive men, their boots making the most stereotypically ominous stormtrooper noise, entered the camp carrying restraints. They stomped by the phones, down the stairs, and down the hallway toward the camp CO's office. Every prisoner picked up on those sounds, no matter where they were in the building, and the front hall quickly and quietly filled with women, gathering to see it go down. Sometimes, when someone was getting locked up for doing something shitty, or when the miscreant was widely disliked, there was an air of the tumbrils on the way to the guillotine. This was not one of those times. The PA crackled as Mr. Scott called the condemned. "Gerard!" Little Alice Gerard came up to the office and stepped inside. The door closed, and she was in there with those 3 huge men, as the lieutenant read her the shot that had been filed against her. A buzz was building among the women. "This is bullshit. This ain't no thing for the SHU. That little lady didn't do a damn thing that didn't need to be done." Someone started to cry. "I can't believe these pansy-ass cracker cops got nothing better to do with their time than lock up Alice." The door to the office swung open. Alice stepped out, followed by the 3 jailers. They loomed over her, making her look extra tiny as she gazed up at the assembled crowd. Blinking through her Coke bottle glasses, she said brightly and clearly, "I'm going." One of the lieutenant's goons cuffed her, not that gently, and the buzz among the women surged to a low roar. Then Sheena started to chant, "Alice, Alice, 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 Alice," as they led the little pacifist away. I had never seen prison guards look scared before. One hot afternoon found me under a tree, trying to stay out of the sun. Along came Mrs. Jones, with Inky, her constant companion. I had finished her final paper, a pretty straightforward essay I had pieced together about the role that hybrid cars might play in the future economy. I had tried to pull some big ideas from managing in the next society into my argument about knowledge-based economies, globalization, and the ways in which demographics change society. But it was upsetting to think about what role the millions of Americans who were former prisoners might play in the next society. I knew from the Families Against Mandatory Minimums, FAMM, newsletters, which many prisoners received, that over 600,000 returned home from prison every year. The only markets most of them were accustomed to participating in were underground economies, and nothing about the prison system that I had seen showed them any other route to take when they hit the streets again. I could count on 2 hands the number of women in Danbury who had participated in a real vocational program. Pop, who had earned a food service certificate down at the FCI, Linda Vega, who worked as the camp's dental hygienist, and the handful of women who worked in Unicor. For the rest, maybe their work scrubbing prison floors or in the plumbing shop might translate toward a real job, but I was skeptical. There was no continuity at all between the prison economy, including prison jobs, and the mainstream economy. "Hey, Mrs. Jones, did you get the paper back yet? I was just coming to talk to you about it. I'm mad as hell." I sat up, worried. Had she been busted? Maybe a disgruntled classmate had ratted her out? That wouldn't shock me. "What's wrong?" "We got an A-." I laughed, which only made her more irritated. "What was the problem?" she wailed. "It was a great paper. I read it, just like I said I would." She was very indignant. "Maybe he didn't want you getting too cocky, Mrs. J. I think an A- is just great." I don't know what they're thinking. Well, anyway, I wanted to say thank you. You're a nice girl." And with that, she jerked Inky's leash and marched off. A couple months later, she was marching again. All of the women who had completed the GED or college classes were honored in a ceremony held in the visiting room. Miss Natalie, Pennsatucky, Camilla, and of course Mrs. Jones would be wearing mortar boards, along with a number of other women. Each graduate was allowed to invite a set number of guests from either the outside or the inside, and I would be attending as a guest of the OG. The valedictorian was Bobby, who had scored the highest on the GED exam. Over the weeks leading up to the ceremony, she agonized over her address, writing and rewriting it. The day dawned scorching hot, and the room was set up with 2 banks of chairs facing each other, graduates versus guests. The women filed in solemnly, looking sharp in their caps and gowns, black for the GED students, bright blue for the collegians. There was a podium, where Bobby would give her speech, but first we would have to hear from Warden DeBoo. This would be her swan song. She was getting a brand new prison in California to supervise, and we were getting a new warden, a guy from Florida. Bobby gave a great speech. She had picked a theme, We Did It, and was off and running, congratulating her fellow students for getting it done, reminding all assembled that achieving a diploma was not easy in this setting, but they had done it, and proclaiming that now that everyone knew they could do it, there was nothing else they couldn't do if they stuck with it. And they each had a diploma to prove it to the world. I was impressed by the care Bobby had put into her words, and by how well she delivered them, with just the right edge of defiance. The speech was brief, lean, and mean, but firmly asserted that it was the graduates' day to celebrate, not the institution's. She spoke forcefully, naturally, and with pride. Afterward, the prisoners were allowed to have pictures taken. Against a fake cherry tree backdrop in a corner of the visiting room, I stood with my friends, each of whom I was proud to know. Bobby, posing with a group of us clustered around her in our khakis, looking stern and short in her robes and special gold-corded valedictorian's robe, but her hair was blown out and beautifully curled. In one snapshot, Pennsatucky and another M&M lit grin as widely as any high school senior in America on their last day. I look so old next to them, smiling in my khaki uniform. My favorite is the photo of me and Mrs. Jones. I stand happily behind her, and she is seated, radiant in her royal blue robe and cap, holding her diploma in front of her with pride. On the back of the picture, in her terrible handwriting, it says, "Thank you. To a dear friend. I made it. God bless you. Mrs. Jones." Chapter 11. Ralph Cramden and the Marlboro Man. I hit a groove, and the days and weeks seemed to go faster. I passed milestones, 1/4 of my sentence, 1/3 of my sentence, and prison seemed more manageable. The outdoors showed me the natural passage of time in a way that was new to a lifelong city girl. I went from trudging through ice, then mud, then grass, mowed by the ladies in grounds. Trees budded, and wildflowers and even peonies bloomed. Baby bunnies appeared at the side of the track and grew into saucy teenage rabbits right before my eyes as I ran around and around that 1/4-mile loop thousands of times. Wild turkeys and deer freely roamed the federal reservation that the prison sat on. I developed a deep distaste for Canada geese, who shat dark green goose poop all over my track. One sunny afternoon, I was loitering on the bench in front of the electric shop in the sun, listlessly trying to read a slim volume of Candide that some wiseacre had sent me. Mr. DeSimon had not shown up to work, a mercifully common experience. That morning it had been difficult to read because of the thundering gunfire. Very close by the CMS shops, hidden about 1/4 mile away in the woods, was the prison's rifle range. Correctional officers could spend quality time with their firearms down there, and the hammering of multiple rounds was typical background noise during our work days. There was something unsettling about toiling away for a prison while listening to your jailers practice shooting you. When we got back from lunch, the gunshots had ceased, and it was once again a placid rural Connecticut day. One of the institution's white pickup trucks pulled up next to me in front of the carpentry shop. "What the hell are you doing, convict?" It was Mr. Thomas, the boss of the shop. The carpentry and construction shops were housed in one building, to the left of the electric shop and on the other side of a shambling greenhouse. The electric shop did not have a bathroom, and we had to walk over to use the one in their building. The bathroom was for single use only, a spacious private room on whose walls someone had painted pretty blue designs. I loved that bathroom. Sometimes when my co-workers in electric were squabbling, or watching illicit trash television when DeSimon wasn't around, I would flee to the bathroom for a few blessed minutes of privacy and quiet. It was the only door in the prison that I could lock. The construction and carpentry shops were led by Mr. King and Mr. Thomas, respectively. Mr. Thomas was round and volcanic, and inclined to noise, jokes, and occasional blue streak outbursts, like a present-day Jackie Gleason. Mr. King was lean and lanky, taciturn and weathered, always with a cigarette dangling from his mouth. He looked like the Marlboro Man. They had been sharing this shop for many years and had a close working relationship. When I would walk into the shop to use the facilities, Mr. Thomas would usually note my presence with a shout, "Hey, criminal!" Now he wanted to know what the hell I was doing. My fellow B-dormer, Alicia Robbins, was in the seat of the truck next to him. Alicia was Jamaican and tight with Miss Natalie. She was giggling, so I doubted that I was in trouble. Nothing?" "Nothing? Well, do you want to work?" "Sure." "Well, get in." I jumped up and climbed into the truck. Alicia scooted over to make room for me. I didn't think I could get in trouble if I was with a CO. Mr. Thomas pressed the gas and the truck took off. We veered past the plumbing and grounds shops, headed behind the FCI, and then abruptly plunged down a steep gravel road. I had no idea where it led. Almost immediately, the buildings disappeared, and all I could see through the pickup's open windows was forest, trees and boulders, and the occasional creek, all sloping sharply downward. The truck's radio was blasting classic rock. I looked at Alicia, who was still giggling. "Where is he taking us?" I asked her. Mr. Thomas snorted. "Boss crazy," was all Alicia would say. The road plunged down, down, down. We had been driving for many minutes. It didn't feel like I was in prison anymore. I felt like a girl in a truck heading toward an adventure. Resting my bare forearm on the truck door, I fixed my gaze deep into the woods, so that when the trees flew by, all I saw was a blur of green and brown. After several minutes, the truck broke into a sort of clearing, and I saw signs of people. In front of us was a picnic area, and some of the women who worked in construction and carpentry were painting wooden picnic tables. But they didn't interest me at all, because what I saw beyond them filled me with so much excitement. The picnic area lay on the edge of an enormous lake, and the June sunlight was glinting off the water that lapped gently at the edge of a boat launch. I gasped. My eyes widened, and I could not have cared less about maintaining my cool. Mr. Thomas parked the truck, and I jumped out. "It's a lake! I can't believe how beautiful it is." Alicia laughed at me, grabbed her painting gear out of the back of the truck, and ambled over to a picnic table. I turned to Mr. Thomas, who was also looking at the lake. "Can I go look at it? Please?" He laughed at me, too. "Sure, just don't jump in. Get me fired." I rushed down to the edge, where there were floating docks, and a number of small motorboats that belonged to prison staff were moored. I was trying to look everywhere at once. On the far bank I could see houses, beautiful houses with lawns that sloped down to the water. The lake appeared to be very long, disappearing out of sight on both my right and my left. I crouched down and stuck both my hands into the cool water. I looked at my 2 white hands through the brownish cast of lake water, palms down, and imagined myself submerged, holding my breath in with my eyes open underwater and kicking as hard as I could to swim fast. I could almost feel the water swirling in currents around my body and my hair rising like a halo around my head. I edged along 10 yards of the lake shore in one direction and back again, thinking that this would be the first summer of my life without swimming. I had always been a total water baby, never scared of the surf. Now I itched to rip off my clothes and throw myself in. But that wouldn't be prudent or fair to the guy nice enough to have brought me down here. The sunlight off the water made me crinkle my eyes. I looked for a long time, and no one said anything to me. Finally, I turned and climbed back up the concrete embankment. I went over to Gisela, who drove the bus and worked for Mr. King, and asked if there were any extra paintbrushes. She smiled. "Sure, let me show you." And I spent the rest of the afternoon silently painting under the trees, listening to boats on the lake and the sounds of water birds. When it was time to go, Mr. Thomas drove us back up to the shops. I got out and stood on the passenger side with my hands on the window frame and looked into the truck at him. "It was really nice of you to bring me down there. Thank you so much, Mr. Thomas. It meant so much to me." He looked away. He seemed embarrassed. "Yeah, well, I know that boss of yours won't bring you down there, so thanks for helping out." He drove away. From that moment forward, I was obsessed with getting back to the lake. Arriving at work one day, we were startled to discover that DeSimon had shaved off his beard and mustache and now looked a lot like a lost penis, wandering around in search of a body. My interactions with him had grown unpleasant, as I resented the fact that I worked for the nastiest man in construction services, and he seemed to take perverse pleasure in treating me in as degrading a manner as he could devise. At lunch, I was complaining bitterly about him when Gisela stopped me. "Why don't you come work in construction? I'm going home in September. Mr. King will need somebody good. He's so nice, Piper." It hadn't occurred to me that I could change jobs. A couple days later, I sidled up to Mr. King in front of the shop, shy but desperate. I wasn't used to asking COs for anything. "Mr. King, I know that Gisela is leaving soon, and I was wondering if maybe I could come work for you in construction." I waited, hopefully. I knew I was a desirable prison employee. I had my prison license, was willing to work, never idled, faked being sick, was educated, and could read manuals, do math, and so forth. And I didn't have a big mouth. Mr. King looked at me, chewing on his cigarette, flinty eyes unreadable. "Sure." My heart leaped, then crashed. "But DeSimon has to sign your cop-out." I wrote up the cop-out, a simple one-page form, the official title of which was BP S140A-055 Inmate Request to Staff. The next morning, I marched into DeSimon's office and handed it to him. He did not take it from me. After a while, I got tired of thrusting it toward him and put it on the desk. He looked at it with distaste. "What is that, Kermit?" "It's a cop-out, asking you to let me go work in construction, Mr. DeSimon." He didn't even read it. "The answer is no, Kermit." I looked at him, his bulbous, shiny pink head, and smiled grimly. I wasn't surprised. I marched back out of the office. "What did he say?" asked Amy. We were down to me, my young eminent-lit pal, Yvette, and a couple other women working in the dim, airless electric shop. "What do you think?" I said. Amy just laughed, with a hollow wisdom way beyond her years. "Piper, that man is not going to let you go anywhere. so you might as well get used to him. I was furious. Now that I knew there was a better way to live within the confines of the prison, that there were jobs where prisoners were not the constant object of insults, I was desperate to make the switch. Getting out of Electric and escaping from DeSimon filled my thoughts. Summer was getting hot, and for months we had been working on a new circuit for the visiting room air conditioners. The only rooms in the camp that had air conditioners were the staff offices and the visiting room, but the existing power was insufficient, and they always tripped off. So we had hung and wired a new circuit panel, bent and run conduit around the visiting room, and wired new outlets. Now we were close to finished, and all that remained was to connect the circuit board to the building's main power source, a floor below in the boiler room. This involved pulling new cables up from the boiler room power source to the new panel in the visiting room, physically yanking them up through the guts of the building. When the momentous day dawned, we all gathered the tools that DeSimon had directed us to bring and stood in the boiler room waiting for direction. We didn't have any big girls in the electric shop, and so reinforcements had been called in from plumbing, which had a bunch of them. DeSimon busied himself with the cables. They were big, thick industrial cables, totally different from the wiring that I now worked with every day. He bundled several of them, then bound them together with black electrical tape, taping over and over until they were bound together for over a foot. At the end, he strung a rope, the end of which was snaked up to the visiting room. The women from plumbing were all up there waiting. Down in the boiler room stood me, Amy, Yvette, and Vasquez. We looked at DeSimon. They're going to pull, and you're going to push. You're going to feed it upward. But we're missing one thing. We need a greaser. The way he said those words, I knew that it must be an unpleasant job. And I knew who it would be. Kermit, you'll be the greaser. Take these. He handed me elbow-length rubber gloves. Now, grab that tub of lube. He pointed at a vat of industrial lubricant next to his feet. I could see where this was going. My cheeks were beginning to burn. You're going to need a lot, Kermit. I grabbed the container. DeSimon shoved the bound cables toward me. They were rigid and inflexible, and I was rigid with humiliation. That's going to need a lot to squeeze in there, Kermit. Lube it up good. I bent and scooped up 2 handfuls of the stuff. It was like bright blue jelly. I slapped it onto the huge, previously innocuous but now disgusting foot-long phallus. DeSimon threw his head back and yelled, "Pull!" The rope yanked, but not enough to move the cables. "Come on, Kermit. Do your duty." I was so angry I could barely see. I concentrated on turning the blood in my veins into ice. I tried floating up to the ceiling in detachment, but the scene was so ugly that my usual technique didn't work. I scooped up more blue jelly and slapped it all over the bound cables. "Oh, horsecock. You like that horsecock, don't you, Kermit?" Horsecock? I dropped my hands to my sides in their big, gooey gloves. Amy was looking at her shoes, and Yvette was pretending she didn't understand any English. DeSimon yelled, "Pull!" again, and somewhere above us, prison laborers heaved on the rope. The cables slid. "Pull!" They slid again. "Push!" My co-workers pushed the cables upward. Seeing them strain, I bent my knees and helped them push up as hard as I could. The cables started to slither upward, and then it was all over but the pulling. I stalked out of the boiler room, stripped off the gloves, and threw them down. I was blind, nuclear mad, and all I could do was throw the ladders, the tools, and the gear into the back of the truck as hard as I could. My co-workers were unnerved. I didn't speak to anyone for the rest of the afternoon, and DeSimon didn't speak to me. Back in the camp, I tried to shower the slime and humiliation off me. Then I wrote another cop-out, this time to DeSimon's boss. It read something like this. As I have discussed with you on previous occasions, Mr. DeSimon, my work supervisor, sometimes speaks to us at work in ways that I find crude, disrespectful, and sexually graphic. On 3/23/04, while working in the boiler room on the new electric circuit for the visiting room, we were working with large electric wires bound together with electrical tape. Mr. DeSimon referred to these materials, which I had to grease to pull through pipes, as horse genitalia, which I found very offensive. He did not use the word genitalia, but rather a vulgarity. That was all the room there was to explain a request on a cop-out. I was not going to spend the next 7 months under the thumb of this pig, I vowed, and I hoped that in the form of horsecock he had handed me the trump card for my escape. At my next opportunity, I went to the office of DeSimon's boss. He was a horse of a different color, making a career of the BOP and moving from prison to prison, climbing the corporate ladder. He was from Texas, where they certainly know something about prisons, and a complete professional. Very tall, he always wore a tie and often cowboy boots, and was unfailingly polite. He was also even-handed, which won him the admiration of the prisoners. Pop called him my Texas Ranger, and liked it when he would come up to the camp to eat our cooking. I knocked on his door, walked in, and handed him my cop-out. He read through it silently, then looked up at me. "Miss Kerman, I'm not sure I understand what you're trying to say here. Will you please have a seat?" I sat and took off my white baseball cap. I could feel my cheeks getting hot again. I chose a spot on his desk to stare at so I wouldn't have to make eye contact with him, so he couldn't see my shame and I wouldn't start crying in front of a police. Then I explained what my cop-out meant, in great detail. When I finally finished, I took a deep breath. Then I raised my eyes and looked at Tex. He was as red as I was. "I'll switch you out of there immediately," he said. July dawned with a sour flavor. The entire camp facility seemed to groan in the heat, overtaxed. The phones stopped working. The washing machines broke, a horror show. Suddenly all the hair dryers disappeared. 200 women, no phones, no washing machines, no hair dryers. It was like Lord of the Flies on estrogen. I sure as hell wasn't going to be Piggy. To escape the camp's simmering tensions, I liked to sit under the row of pine trees overlooking the track and the valley beyond, especially at sunset. Now that I knew what the lake looked like, I would imagine diving in, deep under the water, and swimming away. I would strain my ears to catch the sound of the motorboats far below. It was such a pretty spot here. Why did they have to ruin it with a prison? I missed Larry terribly on those evenings, wishing that I were with him. I checked the call-out every day to see if my work assignment had changed. After a week, I learned that my attempt to escape the electric shop had been thwarted because rotten DeSimon had gone on vacation unannounced, and Tex wouldn't transfer me out to construction until he returned. I couldn't understand this at all. But when I pressed him, sounding as desperate as I was, the big Texan put his hands up as if to say, "Stop. You're going to have to trust me and be patient, Miss Kerman. I'll get you out of there." Miraculously, my transfer from electric to construction finally happened, popping up on the call-out at the end of July. Tex had been as good as his word. I did a little victory dance in the camp's main hall. My new co-workers included my buddy, Allie B., the cheerful 6-foot oddball from B-dorm, and Pennsatucky, who was in contention for white girl with the biggest mouth. The carpentry shop was largely made up of Spanish mommies, including Maria Carbone, the almost catatonic girl I had greeted in room 6 back in February. She had regained her equilibrium in the intervening months, and the difference between that terrified girl and this slightly macho, bravado-filled convict was striking. Everyone was welcoming to me, and there was no evidence of the downtrodden misery I was used to in electric. The construction and carpentry shops were housed together and smelled of wood and paint and sawdust. I now worked for Mr. King, the chain-smoking Marlboro man. I had a new neighbor in B-dorm, who I nicknamed Pom-Pom based on her hairdo. Pom-Pom was a bashful 22-year-old who spent a lot of time sleeping and quickly got a rep for laziness. She probably slept so much because she was depressed, a normal enough response to prison. She had been assigned to work in the garage, where she pumped gas into the prison vehicles enthusiastically. She didn't seem lazy to me. If you looked at her and smiled, she would cast her eyes away, but smile her own shy smile. One day in the dinner line, Pom-Pom abruptly turned to me and began to talk. I barely knew her and assumed she must be speaking to someone else, her co-worker Angel, perhaps, who was standing on my other side. No, she was speaking to me, and with some intensity. "Boss called me into his office today and he was asking me if I've had any relatives here before." Mr. Senecal was her boss in the garage. "So he was asking me, and it turns out my mother worked for him." I looked at Pom-Pom. At present, we had 3 sets of sisters locked up in the camp, and another neighbor's mother had apparently been shipped out right before I arrived. At this point in my own prison stay, it was less surprising to me that she was a second-generation federal inmate than that she did not know her mom had worked in the garage. "You didn't know she worked in the garage?" I asked. "No, I knew she was here, my aunt told me, but she never told me nothing about it." I had a terrible suspicion that Pom-Pom's mother might be dead. Angel, her co-worker, was of course listening in and gently asked the question, "Where's your mom?" "I have no idea," replied Pom-Pom. I felt even worse, but I was still curious. How did Senecal know? He just guessed. He thought it was my sister, but he just guessed. "Do you look like your mom?" He guessed from looking at you. "I guess so. He asked me, tall and skinny, right?" Pom-Pom laughed. "He said he just had a feeling, so he asked me. And then he asked me what I was doing here." I wondered if the prison staff connected the miseries of their chosen profession with the miseries of their prisoners' children. Did it trouble Mike Senecal to find Pom-Pom in Danbury? And was he waiting for her children to show up? Maybe if her mother had been put in treatment for her addictions, which were implicit, rather than in the garage in Danbury, Pom-Pom wouldn't be standing in his office today. "What did Senecal say about your mom?" "He said she never gave him any trouble." I didn't much care for Pom-Pom's boss, but I liked to hang out in the garage. I stopped in every morning to get the white construction pickup and shoot the breeze with the gals who worked there pumping gas and fixing trucks. There was a debate going on about what was the song of the summer. Angel said it was the big crossover reggaeton hit with Daddy Yankee. I didn't know the name was Oye Mi Canto, but we could all sing the refrain. Boricua, Moreno, Dominicano, Colombiano, Boricua, Morena, Cubano, Mexicano, Oye Mi Canto. Bonnie snorted. "Y'all are crazy," she said. "It's Fat Joe." We all replied, leaned back, and dropped one shoulder back in smooth unison. Kenyatta said, "Well, I don't like her, but that song by Christina Milian, Pop, Pop, Pop That Thing, that song is blowing up." This made me giggle. In yoga class the other day, Yoga Janet had been trying to get us to loosen up our hips. "Okay, everyone, wiggle your hips, shake them out. Now rotate them, circle left, now right. Okay, now I want you to pop your hips forward, your pelvis in a smooth motion. I want you to pop that thing." Sister Platy had been bemused. Pop that thing? Camilla and I had died. Pom-Pom spoke up. "I don't know where you think y'all are at, but there's just one song this summer, and that's Locked Up. Look around you. End of discussion." We had to admit she was dead on. All summer long, anywhere there was a radio playing, You could hear the almost eerie, plaintive voice of Akon, a Senegalese rapper, singing about prison. Can't wait to get out and move forward with my life. Got a family that loves me and wants me to do right, but instead I'm here locked up. Even if the song had not been a huge hit on the outs, it had to be the guiding anthem in a place like the camp. You heard women who weren't even hip-hop fans humming it tunelessly under their breath as they folded laundry. I'm locked up. They won't let me out. No, they won't let me out. I'm locked up.